Welcome to The City That Votes, a television series from the Chicago Board of Elections, taking you behind the polling place curtain for a look at how our election system works in the Windy City. I'm Max Bever, Director of Public Information, and your host for the program. We are in the midst of a familiar political season in our city as the Chicago Electoral Board currently is hearing objections to the nominating petitions filed by candidates to appear on the March 17, 2026 primary ballot. From U.S. Senator to Cook County Assessor, from our state's governor to the commissioners of the Water Reclamation District, many candidates are currently defending their petitions so they can vie for those offices and be their party's candidate for the November 3rd general election. This episode, we're going to discuss the ins and outs of this electoral board and petition process with the board's general counsel, Adam Lasker. Adam, thanks for joining us on The City That Votes.
Thank you, Max. Very happy to be here.
So before we get started in the main meat of this episode, tell me a bit about how you came to the board and what you did before.
Well, before I was with the board, I got involved with election law and working with candidates and referendum petitions, proponents in the private practice of law. And I had a lot of cases at the Electoral Board in Chicago. In fact, one year I had over 43 cases all by myself while I was a sole practitioner. So I got to know a lot of the people at the board from this Electoral Board process. That's how, from the outside, I got to know people working on the inside. My predecessor, Jim Scanlon, held the position for 24 years, and they finally let him retire, and when they did, they asked whether I'd be interested. And so I thought I'd give it a go, and here I am, and I'm very proud and honored to be working with the board.
Well, I'm glad to have you on board too, because every time I've got a question about this process and all the legal details, you're the first person I call, and that's why I wanted to have you on today. You're the person who knows all the details about this. So, topic today, Chicago Electoral Board. What is it? What's its makeup and what's its purpose?
So our electoral board is different than others throughout the state because we have the election commission with our 3 commissioners appointed by the circuit court. These electoral boards do exist around the state. The State Board of Elections has the state officers electoral board, and then counties have a county officers electoral board. Then municipalities like villages and suburbs and townships, they have their own electoral boards as well. So for the city of Chicago, if we did not have an election commission, our electoral board would be comprised of the mayor, the city clerk, and the longest serving alderman. But because we have the commission, our 3 commissioners from the independent board of elections serve as the 3 members of the electoral board. The electoral board only springs to life when an objection is filed against the candidate's nomination papers or against a referendum petition.
So let's talk a little bit about these petitions in the first place. I know that many of our viewers, you've signed a petition in the past, you got a friendly campaign volunteer that's outside your grocery store. How and why do these petitions get you on the ballot in the first place?
So the Supreme Court on down court decisions have determined that in the United States, we can put a limitation on your right to ballot access, on your right to run for the office. You have to show what's called a modicum of support. Support from the community, so that we don't want to have too many people on the ballot. That would make it too complicated for us to figure out who's the best possible candidate. So in Illinois and many other states, you show the modicum of support by gathering signatures from registered voters on your nominating petition papers. And in Illinois, that's the way it works for essentially every elected office. For example, if you want to run for mayor of the city of Chicago, you have to gather at least 12,500 valid signatures, which is one of the highest signature requirements.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. And some people think it's too much. But when you look at our most recent mayoral election, we had 9 qualified candidates on the ballot. 4 years before that, we had 14 qualified candidates. So in a city this large, there are, it seems, plenty of people who are able to get that modicum of support, even with a signature requirement that high.
So this is, sometimes an interesting process, maybe even a messy process, but this is also why we don't have 300, 400 candidates for one office on one ballot, right?
Which could get unwieldy and just not a benefit to the voters, yes.
So I've got a couple of questions that often come to my way, both from media, from other voters and the like, and also maybe dispel some misconceptions about signing petitions. But does signing a petition mean that you have to support that candidate or vote for them in the future?
No. Signing a nominating petition for a candidate does mean that you're supporting that candidate to the extent that you want to see that person's name on the ballot. You want them to have an opportunity to run for the office. You want to see their campaign amongst the other people who are campaigning for the office. It, however, is not a commitment to actually vote for that person when the day of the election comes. So you're free every time you enter the polling place and enter your voting booth. You have that secrecy, the privacy of the voting booth, and you get to vote for whomever you want, no matter whether you sign their nomination papers or not.
Got it. So another question that often comes up, but can you sign multiple petitions, or is that going to get you in trouble or the candidate in trouble?
If you do, well, so there's different rules for different elections, first of all. We're currently involved in the general election cycle for the November of the even numbered year general election and the primary that comes in March. For those established political party primaries, you can sign the nominating petitions of multiple candidates in the same political party. You are not allowed to sign for candidates of multiple parties. You have to choose one party and stay within that for petition filing purpose or petition signing purposes. With the local, municipal, the mayoral, and the aldermanic elections, which are nonpartisan, you are allowed to to sign the petition only for one candidate for each of the offices that's on the ballot.
Okay.
You will not get in trouble if you sign more than one. There's not a criminal penalty for that, but only the first petition that you signed, only that first signature is legally qualified. And the other candidates you've supported, you've signed for, they won't get in trouble, but it's very common that their nomination papers will be objected to. The electoral board that we have going on right now in those particular elections will look and see whose petition did you sign first, and if you signed a second or a third or a fourth in the same race, those other signatures of yours will be invalidated and will not count towards those other candidates.
Objection. So that's really what's going on in our offices
Yeah.
and what's being heard by hearing officers, and that's what the process is playing out at this point. But before we get into that, I just want to take an opportunity to promote our website. So if you want to learn more info about this process, you can go to the Getting on the Ballots page on our website at chicagoelections.gov. There's a page for candidates, there's a page for petition filing, as well as the activity of our Chicago Electoral Board, which will be meeting over the coming weeks. So let's talk a little bit more about these objections. Who can file an objection in the first place?
So under Illinois law, under the Illinois Election Code, any registered voter from the district in which the candidate is running is allowed to file an objection. So if you're running for the office of mayor, anybody who lives in the city of Chicago. Right now we're hearing objections in our electoral board for congressional districts, state representative, and state senate districts. So you have to be a lawful voter within the applicable district in order to file an objection there.
So we've talked a little bit about, signing the petitions, and that's generally, I imagine, one of the more common issues in an objection. But what are some of beyond the common and those common objections that you usually see?
Well, we've seen some challenges against the residency of the candidate. For most offices, the candidate must be a lawful resident of the district in which they're running. That is different than Congress, by the way. Under federal law, you actually do not have to reside within your congressional district. But for mayor, state representative, state senate, and so forth, you do have to reside within the district. So that's a common one. There are also some common mistakes that can happen with the mandatory paperwork that has to come along with your nominating papers. We've discussed the signature petition. Those petition sheets must have included with them a mandatory document called a statement of candidacy. That's a sworn document signed by the candidate under oath with a notary, just affirming that they live within the district, that they're qualified to hold the office that they're seeking. And for some other offices, you have to have some information, for example, that you are an attorney if you're running for the state's attorney's office. That's one document, and if that document is missing, that's a fatal flaw, and your nomination papers will be invalidated. If the document is there but is missing some of the mandatory information, that could also be a problem. So that's something common. Also, along with your nomination papers, there's a document called a Statement of Economic Interests. That is a document that every elected official in Illinois, for state, local, county offices, They have to file a statement of economic interest as an elected official every year. As a candidate, you have to file the statement of economic interests, and when you file that document, you will receive a receipt of filing. The receipt of filing for your statement of economic interest form must be included with your nomination papers, or at least filed with the election authority within the filing period with the nomination papers. It's a mandatory requirement. For state offices, like General Assembly for the state House and the state Senate, you file that document with the Secretary of State's office. With the county and local offices, you file with the county clerk. And so again, you have to file the document, but then you get that receipt of filing to go along with your nomination papers. It's not a complicated process, but if you're not aware of it, that can screw you up, because if you don't have that receipt filed within the filing period, your nomination papers will be invalid.
So a lot of small details, a lot of layers of government here. I guess this is why, like, your main advice whenever I call you up when people have got these questions is get a lawyer or get an election lawyer, right?
It's, as an election lawyer, we talk about that, this is not rocket science. It's not brain surgery, but it's a complicated process to some extent. You have mentioned the Board of Elections website. We do have some helpful guides on that website. The State Board of Elections also has a candidate's guide. For every election cycle, they come out with a candidate's guide. I highly recommend visiting the State Board and our Board of Elections websites with those valuable pieces of information, because the information about the required forms is in there. We tell the required forms. The State Board has sample forms that you can use. So that's a good way to get started. But it's always recommended that you consult with a campaign lawyer too.
Well, and that website again is chicagoelections.gov. It's our Getting on the Ballots. We've got several web pages dedicated to this, as well as tracking for the 23 objections that we have going through the system right now, which is a little less than you've seen in some previous years.
This is a strange cycle, and the cycles are always somewhat different. But for a midterm general election primary, we would usually have anywhere from 40 to 60 or even as high as 80 cases in the past. We have only 23 cases right now, which means I might actually get to appreciate and enjoy the holidays with my children.
You might get a Christmas.
The strange thing is, though, the State Board of Elections right now has, I believe it's a total of 77 cases, which is way more than they usually get. So you just never know what to expect. We were preparing for as many as 80 cases, so 23 feels pretty good for us. But at the same time, the State Board is having more than ever. So it's,
well, a lot of candidates in this cycle, but also a lot of open seats or people who are not running again. So I know a lot of attention on that U.S. Senate race that I know the Illinois State Board is hearing those objections.
That's
right?
correct. Yep.
So we've got the objections. Say that they, are decided against by the Chicago Electoral Board. They are kicked off the ballot based off of, one of those objections being, those reasons going through. What is the next step of the process from there once a candidate's removed at this start from the Chicago Electoral Board?
So this is a very expedited process to start off with. We started our objection hearings on the 19th of November. We're hoping to have everything finished up by the end of December or slightly into the new year, because the ballot certification deadline for the State Board of Elections is coming up rapidly. I think it's about January 6th or thereabout. The county clerk's ballot certification deadline is a week after that. So we try to handle our cases as quickly as you can. Then the election code says if you don't like the decision you got from our electoral board, you have 5 calendar days to file a petition for judicial review in the proper circuit court. For our cases, that's the Circuit Court of Cook County. So any person who is, as the election code calls, aggrieved with the decision of the electoral board can seek judicial review in the circuit court. Then one judge from the circuit court will hear that appeal at the circuit court level. That can then be appealed to the appellate court, Illinois appellate court, and then up to the Illinois Supreme Court. Some cases do actually make it that far.
So this upcoming ballot, March 17th, these are candidates for governor, they're candidates for congressional offices, for Senate, as well as county and other local offices. However, I know that we've got some other electoral board sessions coming up next year in the summer and then later in the year, including, I know, a lot of attention that's going to be paid on the Chicago Elected School Board.
Yes. And
the first time that there's going to be full 20 seats that are open, as well as the board president. So when do those candidates start gathering, and how does that process play out in the nonpartisan sphere?
So talking about overlapping election schedules, we always consider that our election cycle begins when the nominating petition signature circulation period begins. For the nonpartisan school board candidates whose names will go straight to the November general election ballot, they start circulating nomination papers on February 24th of next year. So just a short while away.
Even before the next election. So.
That's before the March primary, they will start circulating their petitions. They'll circulate right on through that primary election. Their filing period for their nomination papers is May 18th to May 26th of next year, 2026.
So this is going to be an ongoing kind of electoral board session through all the next year, because right after that, we're heading into the municipal elections for mayor, for alderpeople, and police district councils, correct?
That's correct. So for the local offices, July 28th of next year is when they start circulating their nomination papers. Their filing period is October 19th to the 26th of 2026. We will 2 or 3 weeks thereafter start hearing objections for all those cases, which tends to be Chicago's busiest season for electoral board cases, as we then have the November general election moving into the February of 2027 local, municipal, and aldermanic elections.
Mm-hmm. So I do want to take some time to talk about some of your, favorite war stories or history of some of the cases that have gone. But I do have a question that pops up with some of our voters and, comes my way often. But how can a voter update their signature on their file when it comes to their registration to make sure that if they've signed that petition for a candidate, that it's matching their most current signature?
That is a good question. We've been discussing nominating petitions that are signed by the voters. The Electoral Board's biggest process is comparing those challenged signatures to the voter's original voter registration signature that we have on file. So that's sort of the basis of your question. I would point out that same kind of comparison happens at the precincts when you go to vote and you sign your ballot application at the precinct. Those election judges have a clip of your voter registration signature on the electronic poll book there, and they're comparing those signatures to make sure you are who you say you are. The same thing happens through vote by mail. When you sign that certification envelope that you return the ballot to us, that comes in, and election officials at our office review that signature against your voter registration signature. And the same thing happens at early voting sites. So that registration signature we have on file is an important thing. Our board does have a process with a form you can submit to update your signature, because we recognize, just like the viewers at home, I'm sure none of your signatures are exactly the same now as they were 5 years or 10 years ago. Some people can develop physical disabilities that change their signature. And sometimes it just matters, like I'm signing a nominating petition on a clipboard, so my signature looks different than when I registered to vote on a table. Things can change.
Yeah.
So if you want to update your signature, we've got forms for that. Check out our website. Give Max Bever a call. He'll let you know what to do.
Well, mine has certainly changed through the years. I think my mother makes fun of it looking like a doctor's signature now. So if yours has changed or you want to update that on your registration, you can go to chicagoelections.gov. It's our registration page. There's an option for updating your signature. As long as you fill out that form, mail it back into us, or drop it off at the board, your signature will be updated, and then you don't have to worry about it moving forward. So now that I've got you here, I want to hear some of these electoral board stories through the years. What are some of the most memorable cases that you've seen during your tenure, both at the board or on the other side of the aisle?
So when I was still in the private practice, I was hired by a sitting alderman running for re-election, and one of his opponents in the race had run against him 4 years earlier. And being a savvy politician that he was, the alderman had saved copies of his nomination, of his opponent's nomination papers from the prior election. They sent me those copies from 4 years ago, and then of course I went to the Board of Elections, obtained the current copy of the current nomination papers, and saw that they were actually the same signature pages. In the newer version, the headers and footers had been changed with the dates, but as I showed the hearing officer, because this was before I worked with the board, I showed the hearing officer, if you take the petitions from 4 years ago and you take the petitions from this time and you hold them up to a light, you'll see that all of those signatures and the writing of the address, everything is exactly identical, completely overlapped. And it was very clear to the naked eye that these were forgeries that had been filed this time. And the hearing officer started seeing this one right after another as I'm showing sheet after sheet. It was like this. And this candidate got kind of nervous because this is a very apparent fraud. And the candidate just got up and started leaving the room. And the hearing officer sort of chasing after, not chasing, but, selling down the hall. We're going to rule against you even if you leave the hearing, And we did. I did end up getting a favorable ruling. They were, fraudulent nominating papers. So that was a very memorable one because that's an extreme case. And let me just say, if you're running for office, don't. There can be criminal charges for things like that. It's not a good idea. The other case I think is most memorable in my eyes. Again, it was before I worked for the Board of Elections, and with this case, I was not involved. I did not represent any of the parties, but it was when a certain chief of staff at the White House, chief of staff for President Obama, decided to run for mayor. This is Rahm Emanuel.
A familiar name?
A familiar name, and I think for many people, a familiar challenge to his residency. He had moved his family to Washington, D.C. while he was working in the White House, and so I think it was about 41 different objections were filed against him, and it took quite a bit of hearings to get it through the Electoral Board process. He and his family still owned their home here, still had property here, and there is something about your lawful residency. You're allowed to go away for a while and stay somewhere temporarily without creating a lawful residence there,
right,
if you do intend to return. And so Mr. Emanuel won the case because he proved to the Electoral Board that he had that intent to return. He also, when he went to Washington, D.C., he did not update his driver's license. He kept an Illinois driver's license. He kept his voter registration in Chicago. And so he didn't take any of those privileges of citizenship in Washington. I should say privileges of residency in Washington. So he won it at the Electoral Board level. The Circuit Court then affirmed that because they did file a petition for judicial review. The Appellate Court switched it, though, and reversed everything and said, take his name off the ballot. So for a brief period, the Board of Elections had to really change what it was doing and start developing ballots without his name on it. But then the Illinois Supreme Court eventually put him back on the ballot. So that was quite the saga. And I was not involved with the case, but I remember the London Times, of all places, called to ask me questions about how this process works. So as a young lawyer, that was kind of fun for me to be a part of.
Yeah, I think it comes up often, but as long as you've got one voter registration, I think that's very helpful in showing where your intent is or where your residency is, right?
Well, and that's another case that I did handle before I joined the board was an objection that I processed against a person running for alderman. And the problem was that he was living at a home that he certainly owned the house and he lived there, plenty of evidence that, that's where he lived, but he kept his voter registration for all these years back at his parents' house. Mm. And so when you register to vote, you are swearing under penalties of perjury that you're a lawful resident where you are registering to vote. So I was able to win a successful case there because just that one issue of him having his voter registration somewhere else for these purposes, that invalidated his nomination papers at his home.
Mm. Well, I'm glad that you brought up that story, Adam. I feel like it's very important for people to know the Rahm Emanuel saga and that it's well followed. And thanks again for all of your expertise, your insight. I know this is a complicated process. I think our viewers are very thankful for you illuminating us a bit more on this. So thank you again for being on this episode of The City That Votes.
Well, it's my pleasure, Max. Always a pleasure to work with you on behalf of the board.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah.
And if you need to update your signature, as we were discussing, or your address or your name, or any voting information, you can go to our website at chicagoelections.gov to learn more. And you can follow along with the Chicago Electoral Board proceedings on our website as well. So just go to chicagoelections.gov. Thanks again for joining us for The City That Votes from the Chicago Board of Elections. You can follow us on social media. We are at Chicago Election on Facebook, Instagram, X, Blue Sky, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And you can contact me at communications@chicagoelections.gov and let me know more about what you'd like to know more about behind the scenes at the Chicago Board of Elections. Until next time, I'm Max Bever, Director of Public Information, and thank you for tuning in.